Good morning. Welcome to the Point. We are 4 months into the presidency of Donald Trump. This week, a special counsel was appointed to look into some of the activities surrounding both the administration and perhaps some things that happened during the election. Last week, if you recall, we sat down with Congressman Bill Huizenga and talked about the mood in Washington. This week, for the Democratic perspective, we go to Flint Congressman Dan Kildee. Congressman, it has been a very interesting week in Washington. I start every show these days by saying as we speak, because between now and Sunday morning, who knows what changes. But let's start with something that you did this week, somewhat unusual, signing a discharge petition that if a majority of members of the House would have signed, it would have called for a special prosecutor. Between the time you did that and that we talk now, a special counsel has been appointed. Give me your take on that activity.
Well, it's a step in the right direction. We think there are two tracks that need to be followed. The appointment of a special counsel is a big, important step in the right direction because it allows an independent investigation to pursue any criminal activity that might have come from all of this action, all of this debate about the relationship between the Trump campaign, Mr. Flynn, the Russians, etc. Now, the other piece of it, which we are continuing to push for and the discharge petition would require us to vote on, is whether we should have another separate independent commission, a sort of 9/11 style commission, that would look at all of the other matters beyond the possible criminal activity. But what are the other issues? What are the other activities that the American people have a right to know about? So hopefully we're going to get some progress on that as well.
What do you expect? You can't prejudge this, I get it, but what do you think there is to find out there? Because I've expressed to you in the past that as a reporter, I'm frustrated because I can't find out information, don't even know what it is that we're supposed to be suspect of. So what is your theory about what's there?
Well, I think the questions that might not go to criminality have to do with the level of interaction. Coordination may be too strong of a word, or collusion may be a legal term, but the level of interaction between the Trump campaign and the Russians, and the extent to which the Russians did attempt to affect the outcome of our election. Now, while the president still tries to obfuscate that question, this is one of the areas I have real disagreement with him. No one else seems to doubt that the Russians intentionally engaged in activity intended to disrupt the 2016 election. All of our, national security organizations, people on the left, right, and center have pretty much concluded that. But we need to know whether or not there was, significant direct involvement of the Trump campaign, because it's important that we know this. And also because it seems as though in trying to deny this, Mr. Trump and some of the people in the White House may have engaged in trying to tamp down the investigation into that very question. And as is almost always is the case, Rick, and you know this from your years of covering politics, very often it's what people in public life try to do to cover their trail that is a more difficult thing to explain and maybe more problematic than what happened in the first place. That may be what we see in this case.
I don't want to get too much into process, but there are a couple of things. You talked about an independent commission, such as there was for 9/11. Prior to 1999, there was a provision for a special prosecutor, something like Kenneth Starr during the Clinton administration. But that no longer exists, and to get to something like that, that bill would have to be reauthorized. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about a special commission.
A special commission, right, a 9/11 style commission. Congress would have to act in order to impanel something of that nature and then give it a specific charge. The issue of a special prosecutor, it is right that the law has expired that would allow for that. But what happened after the law expired is that the FBI, operating on the assumption that there may be times when public confidence would be heightened if a special prosecutor were named to take on a specific set of questions. So they have their own internal rules within the FBI that determines how, and if so, how, when they would impanel or appoint a special prosecutor. It's under that authority that Mr. Mueller has been appointed. So again, as I said, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not the complete story. We need to get to the rest of the questions that will come up outside of the sort of framework of criminality.
On one hand, there have been many people that have been clamoring for more answers, more questions to be asked, for more light to be shown on whatever it is that we're looking at involved with whatever the Russians may have done, whatever involvement of anybody domestically may have been, what has happened with General Flynn, and what has happened subsequent to all of that. On the other hand, there's a lot of stuff to be done in Washington. There's some really, really big issues. What is this investigation, this entire atmosphere, going to do for the agenda about getting stuff done in that building over your shoulder?
It is basically bringing us to a standstill. And that's why I'm so frustrated. It's why I think an independent commission that can just run with this question outside of Congress is the better path, because we've got to deal with health care. I mean, I may not agree with what the Republicans put before the House of Representatives, but we do have to make some changes. We've got to fix the problems we see in the Affordable Care Act at the very least. Tax policy, we clearly need to address that. The issue that I've been so focused on, infrastructure, we've seen almost nothing from the administration on that. These are the things that people ask us to take on when we got elected to office in 2016. And in fact, many of the things that President Trump himself ran on. So while I'm sure he does not enjoy this, and he may try to discredit the effort, in order for us to pursue the agenda that we are all called to take on, we've got to get this question, this big, I guess, brewing scandal outside of the political process. The special prosecutor, the special appointed counselor will be able to take on the criminal aspect of it. A bipartisan sort of elder statesperson type commission could take on all the other questions, and then we can focus on the agenda that's before us. I hope we can get to that sooner rather than later.
What is the real possibility of that? What is it like when you are on the other end of the Capitol building with all of your colleagues down there? Has this atmosphere, the calls for investigation, has all of this created a different sort of environment that you're working in with your colleagues? Because on one hand you have the president and Republicans, but not all Republicans are at 100% buy-in with this Republican president, as they've made it very clear. Right. Does this fracture relationships in the House?
It's in some ways it just makes the environment more uncertain. Oddly enough, the relationships in the House, I don't think have really been dramatically affected. Just as an example, oddly, one of my sort of friends in the Congress is a guy named Mark Meadows, who happens to be the head of the House Freedom Caucus, a Republican from North Carolina. He and I have almost nothing in common when it comes to policy, but we came in together and we've become friends. We talk about our families. He and I chat all the time. I don't think the relationships are necessarily falling apart within Congress. The relationship between Congress and the executive branch is the worst that I've ever seen it. And I don't think that's just limited to Democrats. The kind of communication we get, the uncertain communication, the mixed signals that we get when the signals actually come from the White House, it makes it hard for us just to do our work, because we never really know where the White House is on any particular subject. That's probably a bigger problem. I think Congress itself, we've been through worse things, and we continue to work together. But we need some kind of a partner at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, and right now we've got nothing.
Let's talk about some of those policy issues that I know you're concerned with, that the president campaigned on, that Republicans talk about. One of those, and we're going to get to health care and some others later where you're going to have some differences, but one where you may have some common ground with the president was something addressed this week, or at least the beginning of it, and that's another look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, something that has impacted your hometown of Flint very heavily, as it has the entire state of Michigan. Give me your take on the president's view of what should happen with NAFTA.
Well, I agree with him that we should renegotiate NAFTA. Number one, it's over 20 years old and the economy has changed. But even some of the assumptions that NAFTA was based upon have not come to pass. For example, Mexican worker wages have not risen. the way we expected this engagement to sort of equalize the economies in these two countries. Our relationship to Canada, we have the occasional issue, but those are anomalies. So I think we can work through any issues we have with them. This is really about renegotiating NAFTA to deal with the changes that need to be made regarding Mexico. For me, it's something called the rules of origin, which is a really obscure term, but it has to do with, like for an automobile, how much of an automobile can be made in Mexico in order for it to be considered part of the NAFTA agreement. Right now, you can have almost 2/3 of a vehicle made somewhere else and have those parts shipped in, and then we have to call it a Mexican car, a Mexican-built car. It could come from China, where they manipulate their currency. We want to fix that, so that if we're going to have an agreement, it has to be a much higher percentage of the vehicle made in one of the 3 signatory nations. That's just an example of one of these sort of details that sounds kind of wonky, but really make a difference when it comes to American workers being put in a position of having to compete with products being built in Mexico. Those are the kind of details we've got to get into, and if we don't, then simply renegotiating the agreement in name only, but ending up with some of those same problems, that's not going to be enough. The details matter.
This is one of those questions that probably is difficult to answer, though I know you must have a take on this. As you point out, NAFTA is over 2 decades old. In that period of time, there has been a considerable change in where you grew up, where you live in Flint, Michigan. How much of an impact has the North American Free Trade Agreement had on Flint and Michigan as a broader basis from your standpoint?
It has been significant, and I think a fair analysis would say that globalization generally, the advance of technology specifically, and these bad trade deals have all conspired against Flint. We've lost 90% of our manufacturing jobs. Not all of them can be attributed to these bad trade deals. When you think about the advance of technology and how manufacturing has changed, fewer people are needed to create more vehicles, to be more productive. And globalization generally has changed the way the economy works. But you take those factors and then double down on the job losses by allowing our own factories and the equipment that we once had here in Michigan to be shipped to Mexico and then pay those workers a mere fraction of what an American worker makes. It makes those other factors that much more difficult for us to overcome. So, very often we talk about trade as if it's the only factor that determines job loss. It's not, but it's one of several. And it's one, unlike the others, that we have some control over, that we can actually do something about. And that's why these negotiations are so important.
When we come back, we'll talk with the congressman about other potential policy matters that could come up in Congress, that is, if the environment allows. That's all next. To the point. Welcome back to the Point. This morning we're talking with Congressman Dan Kildee. He's a Democrat from Flint. I asked the congressman about a number of different policy issues. Understanding with the current environment in Washington, getting anything done may be very difficult, but we talked about a couple of issues that he said are important, though difficult. We were talking about health care earlier, and you said you may not agree with what Republicans are doing, but you do agree that something has to be done. Give me your take of what is the possible, because you know that Republicans have voted over 50 times to repeal all or part of the Affordable Care Act. They campaigned on it heavily. Without some type of change, I think everybody agrees that the 2018 midterms are going to be a problematic case for Republicans, maybe anyway, depending on how things go. But healthcare is going to be a big part of that. So what is possible that you and some of your Republican colleagues could agree upon, because the bill they passed came out with no Democratic votes?
Yeah, no Democratic votes and 20 Republicans who voted against it. Some of them voted for it, sort of holding their noses, hoping that the Senate would send back something that was much better. So I think in order for us to move forward, the Senate's going to have to try to produce a bill. They are not going to use the House bill as the template for their action. And then we will have 2 pieces of legislation that don't look anything like one another. Probably what will happen is that the Senate passed bill, if they pass one, will not generate enough support in the Republican House in order to pass. What I hope that leads to is a recognition among Democrats and Republicans that we need to just de-weaponize health care, take it out of this political environment. In 2010, Democrats had their Waterloo based on the Affordable Care Act. In 2018, the Republicans could have the same thing. Let's skip that and then just work on the areas that we know we need to improve within the framework of the Affordable Care Act. And there are things we can do that I think may not be universally supported, but would get a majority of support in the Congress, some combination of Democrats and Republicans, and then move forward and live to fight another day, but not continue this path where it's basically this sort of dichotomy. It's either ACA, as it is right now, Obamacare as it is, or a piece of legislation that nobody really likes, but it's the only alternative. We need to find middle ground, and I think there is room for middle ground.
Moving on to something else that's been talked about a lot, and I think is equally a heavy lift, and you may disagree, but that's tax reform and tax policy change. The president has laid out a very incomplete outline of what he would like to do, talks about some brackets and changing and that type of thing. How much of an appetite is there on your side of the aisle to do something about taxes, both business and personal taxes, and some type of tax reform?
Well, tax policy is kind of like the weather. Everybody complains about it, but it's really hard to do anything about it. Democrats and Republicans know that we need to take on tax reform, but I think sometimes we mean different things when we say that. So it will be tough to do comprehensive tax reform, and it will take a political environment that's a lot better than the one we're in right now, but we have to do it. I mean, I will acknowledge that our tax system is confusing, it's unfair, and it's unfair in a way that makes us less competitive. People at the top, actually, while they might say they pay a higher tax rate, you talk about corporations, for example. One of the suggestions is to reduce the corporate income tax rate. I'm for that, as long as we offset that by taking away all the loopholes that those very same corporations use to avoid paying the top income tax rate. So it's kind of an irrational tax code, because a lot of the folks at the top don't really pay that top rate anyway. Most of the advantages go to the people at the very top. People at the bottom of the economic spectrum, or even in the middle, they generally pay something closer to what the tax code would have them pay, but it's not clear, it's not transparent, and they feel like they're basically paying more than their fair share. We have to fix it, but it is enormously complex, and it's going to be hard, very hard to do.
And again, you point to the environment in which we are operating in Washington now, and that compounds the problem, as you admittedly point out. Here is one area
it sure does, because there's not much trust, and I think trust is going to be important for us to get it done.
Yeah, here is an area that I held out quite a bit of hope for at the very beginning of this administration, because I thought it was the one place where President Trump and his administration might be able to come to Democrats in the House and Senate and say, let's find common ground on infrastructure. And
right.
That is a big price tag, and that complicates tax reform, by the way. But without getting into all of that, there has been no movement on infrastructure. What would you like to see done? Because given the circumstances of your hometown, you have some real experiences with not investing in infrastructure.
For sure. Well, I mean, this is where hindsight's 20/20, but I was saying it from the very beginning. The president should have led with infrastructure, not with health care, because I think they could see what was going to happen with health care. Not even with tax policy, because it's hard to do infrastructure. Well, let me put it this way. It's hard to do a complete tax plan, and then you essentially run out of any of the tools that might be used to fund, say, a national infrastructure bank. Infrastructure should have been the beginning, because it would not only fix a significant problem that we have, our roads and bridges and water systems are crumbling, it would provide some immediate fuel to the economy. Putting people to work would help. And a combination of those two factors, 21st century infrastructure and people going to work to build it, would spur economic growth. And if we know anything about recent American history, if we want to balance the federal budget, reduce the deficit, give ourselves room to think about differences in the tax code, it's a lot easier to do that in a period of robust economic growth than it is in the period that we're in right now, where we're beginning to see some signs that the economy might be slowing down. So infrastructure was a smart thing to do no matter what the motivation was, because it would have allowed us to do so many other things.
And part of the side effect of that might have been building up some political capital there in Washington for this administration if they would have been able to do this.
It's a very good point. That's such a good point, because nothing succeeds like success. And if the president sends a message that he's willing to work with Democrats and Republicans, and actually we're to have led with something that by definition unites us, then building up that trust that is so important, not just between Democrats and Republicans, but between the White House and the Congress, would give us maybe a little incentive to try to take on these, much more difficult questions.
Congressman, I know you made a decision recently that you're going to stay, you're going to continue, or you'll run again for your seat in the House, because clearly, as we've outlined in the last 22 minutes, there's a lot that has to be done in Washington. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your hometown of Flint and where we are today, because we are now 4+ years into this water crisis. There has been some significant monetary investment. There has been some significant work done. But as you pointed out to me a number of times, this isn't going to be a short-term fix. It's going to be long-term.
Right.
How are things in Flint?
Well, they're getting better, but they're getting better pretty slowly. There have been some positive signs lately with the water quality improving. There has now been, of course, this federal commitment that Senator Stabenow and Senator Peters and then I in the House was able to shepherd through. So there's money in place. Those lead service lines are going to be replaced over a 3-year period. The testing is improving. The long-term needs are continuing to show themselves. But we might not be completely there, but it's beginning to feel like we're turning the corner and we can sort of focus on our future again, not so much on the present crisis. But it's been a tough few years, for a town that has already taken quite a few hits as a result of these other changes that we've talked about in the economy. To go through this on top of all that, it's been demoralizing. And we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. People in Flint are strong, and I have a lot of confidence that we'll be back, but it's going to take everybody pulling together to do it.
Congressman, I know it's been an extremely busy week in Washington. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much, Rick.
President Trump is on his first overseas trip of his new administration, just 4 months in, as we pointed out at the top of the show. And already that special counsel is looking into those first 120 days and what happened, perhaps, during the election cycle. It's all something that's going to be captivating official Washington for some months to come. Something we'll be following right here when you join us every Sunday morning. We'll be back with more To the Point. This morning, we have heard some of the questions that the special counsel will be looking into over the next several months. It could even be longer than that. One of those questions, what were the Russians doing during our last election cycle? Was there any involvement of the Trump campaign? What was Michael Flynn's role? What did the president say to the former FBI director about the Michael Flynn investigation? And that's just the beginning. That's something we'll be following closely. You'll be hearing a lot about it, but it will be ongoing, so don't look for any quick answers. In the meantime, there's a lot going on right here in Michigan, too. The legislature is about to wrap up a budget deal, and there'll be a big meeting up on Mackinac Island in 2 weeks. We'll be back next week at a special time at 11 o'clock. I hope you'll join us then. For To the Point,